On January 1st, 1993, at approximately 12:05 a.m., a crowd of New Year's Eve revelers emptied out of bars in Long Kwai Fong in Hong Kong's Central District. As some 20,000 people began to push in the small sloped streets and alleys, it took only moments for some to fall on roads slick with the foam of sprayed beer and champagne. In the ensuing moments, a total of 63 people, mostly under the age of 20, were injured with 21 fatalities due to crushing and asphyxiation. The Long Kwai Fong Stampede would go down in history as a shocking tragedy for Hong Kong. In its wake, public health officials tried to make sense of the risk presented by the gathering and the factors that contributed to the behavior of the crowd. The Long Kwai Fong Stampede is not an isolated event. On December 31st, 2014, another stampede triggered by a New Year's Eve celebration in Shanghai crushed 36 people to death and injured 49 more. Thousands, if not millions, of mass gathering events occur worldwide each year, and stampedes or mass casualty incidents due to crowd size and movement present a consistent hazard. A small but growing body of research on the conditions that produce stampedes has the potential to significantly decrease risk during mass gatherings.
During that Lang Kwai Fong accident, actually it was quite a nightmare for everyone who's involved in the accident. I still remember that I was called to the department about 5 minutes past 12. At that time, there was not much information, only mentioned that several casualties. And then when I arrived, I recognized that there are more than 30, with already two A&E departments being overwhelmed by the casualties. I'm Dr. Cho Chiu Lau. I'm an emergency physician working in Hong Kong, and I was the president of the Hong Kong College of Emergency Medicine in 2005 to 2011. Mass gathering is quite common in Hong Kong, and I remember that the last serious accident occurred in the Lang Kwai Fong New Year Eve, and I was the consultant in charge of the Queen Mary Hospital Accident and Emergency Department. During that accident, there was a stampede and with more than 20 casualties. During the Lang Kwai Fong stampede accidents, we have managed more than 30 casualties in our department with about 20 fatality cases. And we have mobilized the whole hospital on-call staff, medical and nursing, to the A&E department to assist in the resuscitation and immediate trauma management.
Mitigating the myriad risks presented by mass gatherings offers unique challenges for public health workers. In a mass gathering preparedness publication following the World Cup in Brazil, the Center for Disease Control notes the recent examples of mass gatherings with a public health impact. 1993, 69 crowd crush injuries at a Madison, Wisconsin football game. 1996, thousands of heat-related illnesses, 111 injuries and 1 death due to bombing at the Atlanta Olympics. 1997, meningococcal outbreak from a soccer event in Belgium. 2000, meningococcal outbreak from Hajj pilgrims, 90 cases and 14 deaths. 2008, influenza outbreak at World Youth Day in Australia. 2010, measles outbreaks in Germany from a Christian pilgrimage in France. 2013, norovirus disease outbreak at World Youth Day in Brazil. Only one of these examples highlights the serious risk posed by stampede or crowd crush in mass gatherings, but the CDC focuses on infectious diseases, not crowd control. The fact that the CDC mentions the stampede event in 1993 is indicative of an underreported but ever-present need for mass gathering preparedness that crosses from public health into multiple domains. Unlike preparedness measures to minimize the transmission of a disease, every aspect of a mass gathering has the potential to provoke a mass casualty event. From the density of the crowd to the dimensions of nearby entrances and exits, and from the weather conditions to the temperament of security personnel, mass gathering events require exceptional planning, communication, and coordination by a wide variety of actors in order to ensure the inherently dynamic and unpredictable changes in a crowd do not quickly escalate into a mass casualty event. The highest risk mass gatherings involving large crowds or unplanned events have historically given vastly outnumbered public health workers, medical, and security personnel little time to prepare or anticipate. Generally, these events force organizers to rely on the propriety of the crowd to ensure their own correct conduct and safety. However, gatherings are by nature dynamic, and unpredictable catalysts or sudden group impulses can trigger rapid and massive movements with catastrophic implications. Whether it's a rush of movement towards a stage or a stampede that results as a crowd flees a fire or explosion, the uncontrolled force of a crowd can kill or seriously injure thousands in seconds. Amidst the rapid onset of a crushing or fleeing crowd, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to reach vulnerable individuals, to alter a crowd's momentum, or to mount a timely medical response to save the severely injured. This is why an understanding of the factors that lead to these events is essential for preparedness planning and more specifically for public health workers. The best way to deal with these incidents is to identify the key risk factors for an anticipated crowd and location, then to mitigate hazards with the key actors that may be able to quickly affect how a crowd grows, moves, or behaves during a mass gathering. It is the job of public health workers and local officials to learn and to identify these risk factors in any crowded situation so that they can make fast decisions that will inform local preparedness, communication, and response personnel as early as possible. Preparedness activities and protocols are not limited to public health workers. Hospital staff and first responders anticipating mass gathering events have equal responsibility in institutionalizing the highest level of disaster preparedness before an event occurs. Without a clear communication and coordination strategy between the staff and first responders on site and the respective receiving hospitals, a sudden influx of critically injured patients has the potential to diminish quality of care and to encumber the response. In the years after the Long Kwai Fong stampede in Hong Kong, public health workers have taken a proactive approach in preparing for similar situations that may arise when mass gatherings occur.
There are 4 important C's in disaster response: command, control, communication, and coordination. In Hong Kong, the hospital authority is the overall coordination of all the hospital responses. When there are multiple casualties in a mass gathering, the police and the fire department will transfer the patients or the casualties to the hospitals. They will also inform the hospital authority headquarters, who will then divert some casualties to some hospitals. We are usually talking about the golden hour. That means that we will try to transfer the victims to the nearest trauma center within first hours. Certainly, it is best that the frontline worker in the field can communicate with the hospital immediately. However, for actual situation, the frontline worker, like the ambulance man, will be too busy to have time to talk to the hospital. So we will have designated personnel to take up this work. We will have either the ambulance team to have the incident officer to do this coordination and communication work. And if we have the medical team on site, then the job will be taken up by either the medical doctor in the team or by the medical control officer, the MCO. The medical team on site will usually consist of the medical officer and the nurse and maybe some supporting workers. The team will be mainly responsible for patient triage in the field. For the medical control officer, the MCO, who will coordinate all the medical response at the field and who will also coordinate with the relevant parties like the police and the fire service department. This coordination is very important so that appropriate casualties will be transferred to appropriate hospital. For example, if for minor injuries, they will be transferred to lower level of trauma services. However, for those critically trauma patients, they will be transferred to level 3 trauma centers, such that the secondary diversion will be minimized, and also patients will be given the appropriate level of care at the first time that they were transferred to that particular hospitals.
Stampedes can take two forms that relate to the mentality of the crowd. These two forms of crowd movement can be characterized as escape panic and a craze, both of which quickly magnify throughout a crowd and produce similar casualties. Escape panic occurs from mass panic attempts to flee from a detected threat. For example, in 2005, a stampede and crush occurred on the Al Alamein Bridge in Iraq, when rumors of a suicide bomber were circulated and thousands of religious pilgrims fled onto a bridge for safety with a closed gate on the far side. Over 900 people were killed in the ensuing crush, the majority from asphyxiation. In this case, the crowd met an unmovable barrier and had a sudden stop, but could not change the flow of individuals all moving in the same direction. This crushing power can be extreme enough to constrict the lungs of individuals who most often pass out or suffocate standing vertically and held up by the crowd. The second form of stampede happens when there is dense crowds rushing towards something seen as gratifying or a craze. The most notable example of this was one of the first documented crowd disasters in history. On the eve of the Russian Tsar Nicholas II's coronation ceremony in 1896, more than 1,000 people were crushed or trampled to death as the crowd, located in an open field, surged based on rumors that souvenirs were in short supply. Without a barrier or positive force to stop the crowd, there is a higher incident of trampling, where rushing crowds will crush the fallen underfoot or fall themselves and create new obstacles with their bodies. The amount of force created by crowds should not be underestimated. The phrase mass gathering evokes an image of a sea of people. However, fatal stampedes have occurred in crowds numbering just a few hundred. How does this happen? In the cases of crushes during stampedes, it is important to think about the dynamics of crowd flow. Within the crowd, escape panic or craze creates momentum and uncoordinated motion. Some stampedes are turbulent, in which this movement is a push to many directions at once. Others are unidirectional, in which this movement is a push in one direction, oftentimes due to a bottlenecking effect of a physical location. This is an especially critical component of escape panic. In an escape panic scenario, a crowd of people, with as few as a couple dozen, is located within an environment that contains specific features which may contribute to the panic under the right conditions. The characteristic features of escape panic can be summarized as follows. After the introduction of a stimuli, in this case a panic-inducing one, people beginning to move at a higher speed than usual. Soon, as the distance closes between the members of the crowd, pushing begins and the physical interactions between members increases in close proximity. Moving, and in particular, passing of a bottleneck becomes uncoordinated. Communication becomes purely physical. At exits, arching and clogging are observed. Jams build up. The physical interactions in the jammed crowd add up and cause dangerous pressures, which can bend steel barriers or push down brick walls. Escape is further slowed by fallen or injured people acting as obstacles. People show a tendency towards mass behavior, that is, to do what other people do. Alternative exits are often overlooked or not efficiently used in escape situations. This is complicated by terrain and the built environment. Even in smaller crowds, serious compression forces with enough power to bend steel or topple brick walls can be found in a group of just 6 or 7 people moving in one direction. The push created by such a small group can exceed 1,000 pounds of pressure. With stampedes, the risk lies not in numbers exactly, but in the density of the people. Stampedes are known to occur in situations where the density of a crowd, with 10 people per square meter, continues to rise as more and more bodies join in the push. The contributing factors to crowd density include escape panic and craze. bottlenecked surroundings, poor crowd control measures, and a lack of egress routes. It is important for public health officials to recognize where and how risk factors manifest themselves in mass gatherings, and to consider the ways disaster might occur beyond the scenarios for which they prepare. In addition to the religious and cultural events that have given rise to deadly stampedes, mass gatherings in dynamic political environments also pose significant risk to public health. Political mass gatherings take the form of protests or demonstrations, and their political natures complicate the way public health officials prepare for a potential crisis. When protesters or demonstrators take to the streets, high crowd density may be a desired outcome, and the force of a crowd may be an asset in gaining or maintaining territory, even in direct conflict with a police deterrent strategy. For public health workers to prepare for and to respond to a mass casualty event in this environment, it is important to understand the ways in which large groups of protesters are at risk, particularly when protesters or police deliberately use crowd momentum as a tool to take or control territory, implementing chemical and physical crowd control measures, and navigating the physical landscapes in which protests occur. Hong Kong, an autonomous territory 1,958 kilometers south of Beijing on the South China Sea, has been site to some of the most high-profile protests in recent years. With a population numbering around 7 million native Hong Kong citizens and expatriates, the region was once a British colony. In 1997, the British turned over Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China. What remains is a one-country, two-systems framework that splits power between the Beijing government and the Hong Kong government. China oversees foreign relations and defense, and Hong Kong maintains its own judiciary, free press, civil liberties, and some self-governing abilities. The handover protects British laws and capitalism for 50 years under what is called Basic Law. Basic Law also extends universal suffrage, which the Beijing government promised to implement by the year 2017. In August of 2014, Beijing passed a reform framework stating that universal suffrage would take the form of vetting 2 or 3 Hong Kong candidates who would, quote, love the country and allow only them to run for office. On September 22, 2014, Hong Kong students began occupying parts of the Chinese University of Hong Kong to protest the new law. On September 26th, the protest, led by professors and student leaders, was set up in front of the city government headquarters. The protest, or Occupy Hong Kong as it was known, was large-scale, involving not only students, but thousands of Hong Kong residents who were angered by the change to the promise of universal suffrage.
Occupation means that people getting out on the roads without the permission or without any legal permit from the government, and in order to create a strong symbol of protest on certain issue, and that also comes with legal responsibility. So we would call that civil disobedience. I'm Nathan Law Kun Chung, my full name, and I grew up in Hong Kong, and I'm now the legislator in Hong Kong and the youngest in history. And I am an activist and also, of course, a politician. I became involved in politics and social movement 2 years ago when I was a student leader in Umbrella Movement or Umbrella Revolution. And after that, I've been heavily involved in social affairs and politics, and I hope that I could make Hong Kong people a better life by changing the political system into a more democratic one. We have serious socio-economic problems. We have the most serious wealth gap in advanced countries. We have the most unaffordable housing prices, even higher than in London and in New York. We have very, very low social mobility. A lot of people coming out to demand for a democratic system because there are lots of socio-economic problems caused by an unfair political system. People cannot select those who rule Hong Kong. So they cannot change the situation by their votes.
Occupy Central, another group with similar aims, began 2 days later on September 28th. Students and other Hong Kong residents occupied the following areas. Initial arrests of students and student leaders brought more and more people to the streets. Organizers reported that close to 80,000 people were in the street at one point, and the city's financial center was brought to a standstill. In the urban centers of Hong Kong, protesters were packed on streets between buildings, on stairways and connecting walkways, and on main roads between skyscrapers, halting traffic and tarnishing the cosmopolitan city's status as an international financial center.
At the peak, there were around 200,000 of people in the same time on the street, and you just see a massive, massive group of people. And for you, if you stand on the stage, then you couldn't see the end of the people lining up down the stage and waiting for you to speak or waiting for you to explain the following actions or plans. Normally, in the front line, you will see like 3 to 5 layers of people pushing. If they were to have really want to break through the barriers of the police to penetrate the lines of the police to get on the roads, there will be conflicts. Sometimes when we think that the movement or the site is getting to a direction that might become a riot or more violence, we will say that the people who are willing to listen to us, please retreat first.
Crowd control in a mass gathering scenario is ideally a function of the police presence and organizers' planning before an event. In an emergency situation, most crowds will look to police or officials in clear leadership roles to direct them when communication is difficult and information is in short supply. Hong Kong's emergency response planning utilizes police and emergency workers on the ground to guide individuals away from harm or toward emergency medical services. Though this approach might be effective under many circumstances, what happens when the crowd is actually organized in direct opposition to the police? How do police maintain command and control, or even offer guidance to a crowd during an emergency when they are actively engaging in violent conflict with the very same crowd?
It is difficult for the crowd to take control and to pay precautions during a mass gathering. The police is certainly a very important workforce during the disaster management at the scenes. Of course, we will expect the police to give order, command, and control the crowd in a mass gathering. In case any accident occurs at the scene, then the police will take the command and then will divert the casualties or the crowd to the appropriate place. That will be a very difficult job. They should follow the instruction, go to the safe place, and then on the same way that they have to try to protect themselves against any possible injuries.
These are the difficult questions raised by the mass gatherings associated with the Occupy Hong Kong protests. These protests occurred in a uniquely challenging and dangerous environment for protesters and responders alike. New risks and safety approaches to these events must be examined by the public health community in order to successfully adapt to these new circumstances. In Hong Kong, the realities on the ground during the Occupy protests aligned with many of the factors that contribute to a stampede. To prevent disaster in future mass gatherings, specifically at protests, public health practitioners can examine the Hong Kong case and identify how risk factors may align with the factors necessary to produce a stampede. Research shows that stampedes are triggered by the introduction of a stimuli, oftentimes a panic-inducing one, where people begin to move at higher speeds than usual. In a protest setting, this stimuli might be a random occurrence whose danger is compounded by the lack of communication across the crowd and by the surrounding geography. However, the introduction of police crowd control measures complicates the mass gathering scenario that public health officials prepare for and poses a unique set of hazards that could set off a panic or fear response. On the ground in Hong Kong, the protesters took a nonviolent approach to interacting with police, engaging in acts of civil disobedience in the form of occupying territory within the city. The aim of the movement was to send a message with their occupation, packing in tens of thousands of residents to maintain their territory. Oftentimes, the protesters would use the power of their numbers to hold ground as the police attempted to remove them from the street. This push between crowd and police poses a variety of challenges for local first responders. In addition to the physical push that helped both parties claim territory, the police in Hong Kong used chemical compounds commonly used in policing, crowd control, and self-defense to gain territory back from the protesters and to deter their aims of occupation and disruption. In Hong Kong, the main occupied areas were Connaught Road near financial institutions and government complexes, Causeway Bay, and Mong Kok. After the protesters were officially warned near the government buildings, police repeatedly fired volleys of tear gas to rid the area of protesters, and baton-charged the crowd blocking an instrumental government district route. Mong Kok, a mainland shopping district, has one of the highest population densities in the world, with an average of 130,000 people per square kilometer. Mong Kok protesters were packed shoulder to shoulder between buildings and barricades, with clear potential for dangerous crowd densities to spike. Not only did protesters face off with police, there were also reports that anti-occupation groups came to physically challenge the occupiers. Groups of anti-Occupy Central activists, including organized crime members and locals, attacked protesters, resulting in serious injuries. The other protest sites around the government complexes at Central and Admiralty metro stations also had conflicts with police and also featured densely packed crowds between buildings and on staircases.
For the first day of the umbrella movement, they released 87 cans of tear gas in order to evacuate the people on the street. And for now, they're using pepper spray gun. Actually, they will fire pepper spray bullets, while actually harming people and releasing those pepper sprays. So you can see there are a series of escalation about the use of pepper spray. And when they use it massively in the front lines of a protest, they usually use it without any warning. If there were any conflicts with the policemen, they will use it. They will use it just behind one or two lines of policemen, and they will shoot it wherever they like. A lot of people in the front lines, even though they wear masks and even though they wear goggles, they still get hurt. And for those who haven't wear it, their eyes and their mouths are the weakest point of that. I've personally experienced a very high concentration of pepper spray getting into your eye. You lose sight for around 30 minutes, I guess. I don't know the exact time, but you lose your sight because you just couldn't open your eye because that was so serious for that for that feeling. And you need to rinse it with a proper liquid. Sometimes even you don't have it, you could just use water, but that's not the best option. And we need emergency aid station for that emergency treatment because that is not very professional to learn how to rinse your eye with appropriate liquid. But sometimes you need space and you need people for you to really block the other chaos.
In the Occupy Hong Kong movement, the protesters numbered on the front lines were tightly packed to maintain territory. Protests occurred amidst densely packed buildings and with features like stairways, railings, elevated walkways, and police barricades. Protesters in these types of built environments were at risk of falling, blocking crowd movement in the event of a stimuli, with unclear egress routes and escape plans. The introduction of a chemical stimuli has the potential to trigger movement or a fear response within a crowd. In a protest, a movement to escape pain-inflicting crowd control measures can set off a reaction within the group that could result in a stampede. In the event of a sudden shift in crowd momentum, movement would not be easy in an escape panic scenario. Dangerous pressures created by individuals attempting to flee a scene would have enough force to kill or seriously injure members of the crowd. Research shows that in a crisis within a crowd, individuals tend to demonstrate mass behavior and to do what others do without thinking critically about egress routes or alternative options. This is proven to be especially difficult when an individual is stuck in a wave of movement and the event has not been well planned in terms of emergency strategies. Oftentimes, exits will be overlooked, and the built environment and terrain will complicate this further, as will the fallen and injured who will impede crowd movement. This underscores the importance of a reconsideration of crowd control methods and emergency planning for mass gatherings, especially when crowd-controlled methods consist of chemical agents and police rushes.
A lot of human rights agencies in Hong Kong were reporting an excessive use of violence by the police because it was a complete peaceful and non-violent occupation, but the proportion is just not right. Even though there were no immediate deaths during the occupation, but I've heard a lot of cases of losing sight and lying in the hospital for months because of the violence they faced during the occupation. So I still believe that there were excessive use of police violence, and a lot of reports proving that one of the most violent scenes were the special force of the policemen who usually use it to tackle with terrorists. They were well trained, and they were really keen on the orders given by their superiors. A lot of people bleeding on their head, even for those who get down, they stab them, they keep beating him. So there are lots of these brutal scenes, and these people need emergent aid. Sometimes the police will offer you a time slot for you to leave before they have the evacuation. To be very honest, a lot of the protesters, the aim of them are to occupy, to show their discontent and disagreement by having civil disobedience. So sometimes they just don't listen to that warning. And the police could actually use a better way to evacuate them. For example, I've experienced some more peaceful ways to do it, grabbing your arms or grabbing your whole body to get you out the circle, to get you out the road. They could do that, but sometimes they don't. Well, for now, most of the time they don't. They will surround you and offer you one way out. Like for example, they will surround you three sides of where you were, and you only get one side out, and they will run and rush you and try to catch you if you were doing so. So sometimes for those who have less mobility, they are the ones who actually get caught and get beaten because of you run slower than the others.
Given the dense built environment and the complicated human environment, many of the protest locations in Hong Kong had the potential to give rise to a stampede that could kill or injure without warning. Protesters running with impaired vision, or protesters who have fallen to the ground after being injured by chemicals or batons, are additional obstacles for the moving crowd and are nearly impossible to reach by first aid responders. With the possibility of thousands affected, it would be difficult to execute a timely first aid response, much more so amidst a panicking crowd or during a violent police action.
Having professionally trained doctors or nurses or any relevant duties, well, these are very important role or component of an occupation or a protest that might have any chance to have conflict with the policeman. For the police, it depends. I've heard a lot of incidents about them attacking those emergent aid stations. So that's non-humane, and well, for the Human Rights Watch, they seriously condemn these kind of actions because actually they were just saving people. There are lots of scenarios the people need emergent aid. For example, getting hit by pepper spray in their eyes, getting bitten by the baton, bleeding, and some may overheat, some may feel dizzy. Well, these are lots of scenarios that you need to have professionals to assist. So actually during the protest, we got a lot of emergent aid stations really in charge by those people who have professional knowledge. For example, doctors or nurses or even first aiders. So those people actually saved a lot of people's life, and they help people to have a sustainable environment in the occupation.
When there is a mass gathering or major multiple casualties events, most of the time the information is insufficient and inadequate in order for the accident emergency department to prepare. After Language Farm Stampede accidents, the hospitals, under the governance of the hospital authority, started to plan more detailed disaster planning. In a disaster plan, it is very important to anticipate and to prepare for possibility of a mass casualties transferring to the accident emergency department. In the field, we will have disaster triage and also immediate patient management at the scenes. At the hospital level, we will have a more well-structured disaster plan such that mobilization of the resources to reinforce the A&E department and other important functional areas like the ICU, operation theater, etc., so that we can immediately manage all these casualties. And if there are more or multiple casualties, the hospitals will contact the police or the firemen so that they will ask for diversion of the other casualties to the other hospitals so that no one hospital will be overloaded. Of course, there are accidents or incidents that relate to other causes like chemicals or biological weapons. We all have specific disaster plans tailor-made to all these different agents so that we can manage patients coming from different sources of injuries. For example, when we are preparing for the marathon in Hong Kong, we will have all the related agencies or the government departments to sit down to have meetings and then to discuss about where are the possible casualties and how to transfer patients to the hospital. For example, most of the time we will have the rescue station at the finishing point, which most of the time is a lot of casualties will be there. In addition to this, we will also have satellite rescue stations at the route of the marathon, so that in case there's anything happen, we will have a very rapid response. In setting up the station, of course there will be a lot of limitations, but most of the time we'll try to do the minimum efficiently, but then we'll transfer the patient to the relevant rescue station or to the hospital as soon as possible. Even though we have a very well designed disaster plan with involvement of all the relevant parties, with meetings and with exercise or drill, there are still areas for improvement. Most of the time is related to communication and coordination.
You have been asked to perform in an advisory role to law enforcement and hospital officials as they prepare for a new wave of mass gatherings. What information or guidance could you offer to help police and other officials to avoid unnecessary injury or death due to crowded streets and police actions in central Hong Kong?
The resistance will getting more vigorous. But I do believe that the main trend is still a non-violent civil disobedience, because people know that we need an advantage on the numbers of people instead of the escalation of violence. By using violence, the hatred circulates, and it never ends. Well, for the conflict between people to the police, between people to the government. So these are the price of using violent resistance. So I think there are actually frustration after the so-called failure of the movement, the failure of getting a more just political system, and there were several trials about violent resistance. We know that non-violence are more kind of effective way to really try to solve the problems, and we are getting more used to so-called failure, to so-called desperation. So I think, for Hong Kong, there's been 2 years of unpleasant times, but for now we are getting ready for more resistance.